Now for today's program. Michael Krasny has been in broadcast journalism since 1983 and was with ABC in both radio and television before migrating to public broadcasting. He served as host of the award-winning Forum program at KQED, the San Francisco National Public Radio affiliate, where he interviewed many of the world's leading political, cultural, literary, and science and technology figures, as well as major figures from the world of entertainment until his retirement in February. Michael is the recipient of many awards and honors, including Career Achievement Award from the Society of Professional Journalists and an award from the Radio and Television News Directors Association. He is Emeritus Professor of English at San Francisco State University and has also taught at Stanford, the University of San Francisco in California, as well as in the Fulbright International Institutes. A veteran interviewer for the nationally broadcast City Arts and Lectures, Michael is the author of numerous books, including Let There Be Laughter, a treasury of great Jewish humor and what it all means. Rachel Creeger is a multi-award-winning stand-up comedian, writer-director, and the only practicing Orthodox Jewish woman on the mainstream UK comedy circuit. She has over 50 theatrical credits to her name, including directing Deborah Tamer's award-nominated Jewish musical comedy, Mancunian Rhapsody, and Rhea Lena's award-winning show, Dear Daughter. She is best known for her solo stand-up shows, It's No Job for a Nice Jewish Girl, which won the Best Comedy Award at the Greater Manchester Fringe in 2017, and Hanani, as well as her theater shows, Staff Room, and An Insomniac's Guide to Ambulances. Rachel is regularly heard on BBC London Radio, casting a comedic eye on interesting news stories, and was a script associate on the BBC Radio 4 comedy sketch show 2525. Rachel is the resident MC for London Comedy Club Upstairs at the Adam and Eve, and is the co-host of the chat show podcast, Talkin To Me. Please welcome Rachel Creeger and Michael Krasny.
And it's good to be here. Rachel, all the way across the pond and all across the Atlantic. Good to talk to you, and looking forward to talking to you about your career and about humor and about jokes, particularly since Woman has been focusing on jokes. I thought it would be good to begin with sort of the usual kind of general background questions. I want to find out why you took this job, which is no job for a Jewish girl, being a stand-up comic, when as a young girl, I know you were fantasizing being Sandy in Greece. Talk a bit about what you described as your journey. How did you get to the stand-up role that you now have pretty much made a name in, to put it mildly? And why do comedy? Why do you do comedy?
I mean, the last part is really a question for my therapist, I think. But in terms of comedy, I always loved comedy. My dad's side of the family were very, very funny, and they loved jokes, and they would sit around, like I think I wrote about it in the Symposium, how after lunch on a Shabbat or a Yom Tov, they would sit around and just joke at each other almost competitively, and it was all the traditional old Jewish jokes. And do you remember that joke, Michael, where it's about a guy in prison and people get up and shout numbers? Do you know the one I'm talking about? Very old. I think I have
variations of it. Go ahead, tell.
Yeah, no, it's just a guy sent to prison, and they're having dinner. Dinner makes it sound very posh. It's mealtime in prison, and someone gets up and shouts 73, and everybody laughs. And someone else gets up and shouts 104, and everybody laughs. And he says to the guy next to him, what's happening? He says, oh, you know, we've all been here so long that we know all the jokes. So we've numbered them. And then, you know, just everyone just shouts a number. We all laugh because we think of that joke. So the new guy stands up and he says, 86, nothing. And he said, what happened? He goes, the way you told it. I felt like with my family, they loved all those jokes, and they loved the repetition of them and the ones that they all enjoyed. And no one ever said, oh, I've heard that one before, because they wanted to hear it again. And I would like to sit on the stairs outside the room and my grandparents and just listen to all the jokes. And I just grew up with this kind of love for it. I don't want to say my mum's family weren't funny, by the way, but they just weren't into kind of gags. And then was a teenager, I was quite obsessed with comedy and anything theatrical and dramatic, really. And I was, as soon as I kind of could sneak in and look old enough, friends of mine and myself would go to the Comedy Store in London so that we could watch proper live improv and stand up. I watched a lot of it on television. I was very influenced by a performer called Victoria Wood, who was an incredible non-Jewish, but we can still love her, comedian when I was growing up, and sadly passed away a few years ago. But it never seemed like a job that was going to be viable for me as somebody who was a practicing Jew who couldn't do Friday nights in comedy clubs where all the action happens. And it just seemed like quite an unattainable thing. And I did many other things. I worked as, I trained as a therapist. I was in social work. At one point, I was an artist. It took a long time for me to find my path. Memorably, for about a year, I was a dental nurse. Not a good shidduch. And eventually I found my way back to theatre as a kind of hobby, and working with community theatre groups and semi-professional theatre groups. Some of it was performing, some of it was directing. Every so often I wrote things, and eventually that sort of took over from my day job, because people started to notice that I could do stuff and say, well, can you do this for our company? Can you come and work on this project? And I reached a kind of crossroads where I thought, well, maybe this is the time to kind of give it a go, to give up my grown-up job in social work and see what would happen if I just tried theatre. And my love of comedy kind of bloomed once I had that opportunity, because I was directing work, and then once I got to the stage of being able to direct things that I would choose, I was always drawn to comedy, and often the darker the better, which is super Jewish, because we love properly dark jokes because we have quite a dark past. And I began to run a comedy club. That also came about in quite a weird way. I feel it's such a convoluted way of describing the story, but a friend of mine who was a comedian said, you've done a lot of stuff with charities, why don't you put on a charity comedy night that we can perform at, me and my friends, as a kind of rehearsal for the Edinburgh Festival. So people like to do previews of their shows before they take them to Edinburgh. So I ran sort of 2 or 3 of these one-off events, and one of the pubs where we ran one said, oh, would you come and do something more regularly here? And I thought, I love comedy. It's a good way of being connected to comedy. So I started running a regular night. And then after about 7 or 8 months in that venue, things kind of broke down with them, because they didn't really want a regular thing and a regular day in the same place. They kind of wanted everything a bit ad hoc. And one of the other pubs where we'd run a charity night said, oh, come here. So I started in 2011 running comedy clubs. And if someone didn't turn up, like if the host wasn't there, or something needs to be filled in, I would just do stuff, like do a bit. And at the same time, because I was a Jewish educator as well, I was invited to speak in communities and whatever, and everything was always quite comedic. And eventually I found that I was directing and writing comedy, and I was doing theatrical and stand-up comedy as a writer and director. I started to get this like itch to say the words myself. And particularly actually the show that Suzanne mentioned, Dear Daughter, which my brilliant, very, very super talented comedian friend Ria Lena performed and wrote. I co-wrote some parts of it and I directed it, and every so often I'd give her a joke and I'd think, maybe I could say that. And I was very lucky in that I had a lot of support from friends within the industry who had been kind of nagging me for a while to give it a try. And when I was in Edinburgh with Ria and her show, I said to her, what do you think? She said, yes, about time. And then the next day at her show, I came downstairs like after the show was finished, and another comedian friend, professional comedian, was in the foyer talking to someone, and he introduced me as a stand-up. And I said, well, I'm not really a comedian. And he said, you know that 2 or 3 times I've heard you deny you're a comedian, but we all know that you are. You need to think about why you don't want to be one, or why you don't like that label. And it gave me a lot of pause for thought. And I came home and I said to my husband, maybe I am a comedian. Maybe I need to try being a comedian and see how I feel about it.
And that kind of shaped your destiny. I mean, you've had a very illustrious career in so many different facets of vocations and identities, but to become a comic, particularly out of an Orthodox background, I think took some chutzpah, maybe, and courage to actually acknowledge that identity and to own it. And to get
I think there are 2 kind of different aspects of it. One was that when I started off, I didn't want to do Jewish material, my theatrical work wasn't specifically Jewish, other than you know, the occasional thing I direct for someone else. So my own writing wasn't particularly Jewish because I felt like that's my everyday life. So it wasn't really like my fantasy life in my head, or the people that I would make up in their situations. And also because I thought, who would be interested really in my weird Jewish Orthodox life? And so I kind of tried to do other stuff. And then I noticed that every review I got for my plays or for my comedy, every reviewer commented on the Jewishness of it. And I kept thinking, well, why is that? And I realized because it's just in who I am. It's how I talk. It's the musicality of my speech. It's the phrasing of the language. It doesn't really matter if I was reading the phone book, it would still sound like, it would still be very Jewish, maybe because I'd read it like this, I don't know, but it would sound super Jewish. So I think I had to accept that I have this USP, and actually it is interesting because people don't know about it. But also in terms of taking the leap in 2016 of going full time into comedy and not having it as like an occasional thing that I dipped in and out and didn't really attach myself to mentally, was to understand that not doing Friday nights and Saturdays, except for in the winter, was going to always hold me back to an extent. And I had to come to terms with that, which is quite hard, because in the UK on the comedy circuit, the weekend gigs are the big gigs. I think it's similar probably in the States, and the big clubs, they like to kind of nurture you. So they'll put you on initially maybe on a Thursday or a Sunday, and then work you up to a Saturday. Then eventually you'll be one of their Friday night big hitters. And if they know that you're never going to be a Friday night comic, they're not going to even offer you a tryout.
Integrity, really, I think. We have Sandy Koufax on this side of the pond, you know, who refused to pitch on Yom Kippur.
Right.
Or I come from Cleveland, Ohio, where they say Yom Kippur. It's more of a fish holiday. And but, you know, it gave a lot of Jews great pride, as I'm sure there's a feeling toward you by putting your Jewishness out there. I think your Jewishness is out there, but probably on this side of the pond, it's more your Britishness in many ways, in terms of the way you speak and your accent and so forth, which prompts me to say something and ask you something about just the difference between what you might think of as American comedy, because there are a lot of Jewish American comics, not as many as there used to be, but there was a kind of Ashkenazi heritage in the United States that was really dominant. I'm not only talking about the Borscht Belt, I'm talking about comedy writers, about the whole range of what we think of as comedy and joke telling, which has become to some extent not as important as it used to be, but we can perhaps touch on that if you like. But I'm just interested in the differences as you see them between performing in the UK, where you say everything boils down to often Friday night and Saturday morning, and performing in the United States, but not only performing, but what's grist for your mill. I was thinking about, in writing my book about Jewish humor, saying, what is a quintessential Jewish joke? I kept coming back to that question. And one of them, which is a universal joke, but it has a British quality to it, is a joke I'm sure you know about the Queen knighting all of these men who were being knighted. And one of them is a very Orthodox Jewish man who's being knighted for a British counterpart of the Nobel Prize in Physics. And he's got a yarmulke, and the Queen goes and says, why is this knight different from all other knights? I mean, it's a kind of standard corny joke, but in many ways, it's a joke that Jews anywhere recognize as a Jewish joke. So there are those jokes, but then there are so many jokes that fall on the side of American Jewish humor or Eastern European shtetl humor. Not that much, in other words, that really identify as British or specifically Orthodox. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that and address that sense of what's British and what's Orthodox for you.
That's interesting, because I think of myself as a Jewish comic rather than a British one, because that's what makes my stand-up different on the circuit than really most other people's, except for, I guess, people of other ethnic minority groups. For example, there's a Muslim comedian called Fatia El Gori, and she and I actually have loads in common. And she wears a hijab, she covers her hair, and if we're on the same lineup, we joke about, you know, that the only people who've seen each other's hair is like she and I. And actually, we do sometimes message each other if we've had a good hair day, because no one else is going to know.
Give me, Rachel, your babushka, or whatever you want to call it, your headpiece. Is there a shy?
It's not a shaytel, that's hair. This is
real
hair. that's my hair, but this is, I have a hair covering all the time. Yeah, on stage, I go out, I'm the same as I am everywhere else, because I think that if you're your authentic self, then that's much more relatable to people than if you're fake. And this is how I dress. So I address that. So maybe, I don't know if this is a British thing or a Jewish thing, but I feel that it's something that I address very early in a comedy set in a club. The fact that I've got my hair covered, the fact that I'm Jewish and I'm going to talk about my Jewishness, I get that right up front at the beginning. In terms of the difference between American and British humor in that regard, I've yet to gig in America because I was meant to come and start last year and then prepare for a tour there. But I don't know if you know, this guy ate a bat and then we're all on Zoom. But I think there's a difference because the American TV and cinema has been so influenced by Jewish language that I think even people who don't know Jews personally, they have an understanding of the rhythm and language of the way that we speak. So even from shows like Friends, you mentioned Seinfeld, those have so many Jewish influences above and beyond who plays what character. And the same with Broadway shows. So for example, the show Falsettos in America, and when it came here people just didn't really get it because there's so much subtlety in the language and an assumption that the audience will understand. So I've found that it's not so much that I have to translate things. I probably wouldn't go into a pub gig and talk about cholent, but I have to think about what is the relatable words that everyone's going to understand in a way that probably in America I might not have to do. Does that make sense?
Back to a moment then to jokes, because I was reminded when you were just talking about the British versus the American, there's a joke about this very wealthy American couple who goes to England to find the most formal and the most proper British butler they can and bring him back to the States. And they do, and they tell him right away on his first day to set a table for 4. They're going on a walk. They go out on a walk and they come back and the table's set for 8. I said, what happened here? We told you to set the table for 4. They said, yes. But the Rosenblatts called and they said they're bringing the bagels and the bialys. Now, this is you can translate in a number of different ways, but it has its power about the sense of supposedly a Brit not being as aware as he ought to be about American Jewish. And
also, we don't have bialys here. I mean, I know about them because food, but bialys aren't a thing here. We have pretzels.
Yes, I don't. They don't call them bialys though, do they? They call them pretzels for the most part, right?
Yeah, pretzels. Yeah, and on my podcast, You Talking to Me, the pronunciation of bagel as beigel is like that's a very hot topic because depending where you are in England, it's either beigel or bagel. So where I grew up, it was very much beigel. But my comedy partner, Philip, was brought up with bagel. And that is, in fact, you can, if you support the podcast, you get the option for a badge, which I believe if I translate to American, it's called a pin. And you can choose between Team Bagel or Team Beigel and like show your affiliation.
Well, it's like I said before, Yom Kippur, Yom Kippur. You know the joke about it takes place in a British deli, but it could take place, I suppose, in any deli. A woman who walks in and she says she wants a pound of lox, and the man says, no, we call it Nova Scotia. She says, okay, Nova Scotia, and I want a pound of chopped liver. He says, no, we call it pate. And then she says, well, I also want some blintzes. And he says, we call them crepes, ma'am. And she says, okay, can you please deliver this all this Saturday? He says, we never schlep on Shabbos. Now that's a joke that can go around, the horn in terms of its applicability anywhere. But for some reason, the way I've heard it and the way it's told, it takes place in a British deli. And I'm not sure why that's the case, but it is.
Especially because we don't call lox Nova Scotia, we call it smoked salmon. So, yeah, don't come here and ask for your Nova Scotia. We won't give it to you. We don't know what it is.
Let me ask you a serious question, though. I mean, we are talking about some serious things, but how does your orthodoxy, because you're the only Orthodox comic, stand-up comic on the whole UK circuit, in a unique position in so many different ways, but how does that figure into your work and into the schema of the work that you do and your humor? You're out there in your Jewishness, but there's things my father used to say, forgive me for this, but he used to say the Orthodox are like a different religion than we are. They believe in birth control. They don't believe in birth control. They're kashrut, all of these things that separated us as sort of conservative Jews, Reform conservative, whatever, from Orthodox. I mean, is that a source of humor for you, or is that something that your audiences are certainly even aware of?
Yeah, I mean, if they're not aware of it before I start speaking, they're aware of it by the end, because I talk about it. You know, I talk about the fact that I have to think about food wherever I go, you know. So if I'm touring, I can't just go to some whatever local burger place and just get something to eat after the gig. You know, I have to always think about what my food. I think I'd probably always think about food even if I was a doctor. But for this, I have to plan everything in ahead. And I've got jokes about that. So I've got jokes about, you know, not working on Shabbat. I've got jokes about the fact but then I'm just an observational comic. So I've got jokes about the fact I've got allergies, and you know, I talk about the fact that I've got a lot of allergies, and that you know, but because I'm religious as well, so you can be sure that if I so much as went near a shellfish, it would be a battle between whether God would strike me down with a bolt of lightning or I'd go into anaphylactic shock. You know, we don't know what would happen first. And of course, that's also the reason why I hate it when the British media uses Jews as political prawns. It's a silly joke, but it's a nice one.
It's a nice
Thank you. Yeah, I like political prawns. And that's another thing, because
are the political things whisper your mouth? You've done some stuff about anti-Semitism and Corbyn, and so that's also essentially material for you, isn't it?
Yeah, well, whatever happens is material, except for one of my brothers-in-law once said to me he was worried every time he said or did anything in front of me that would end up in my material. And I said, don't worry, you're not that funny. But yeah, I do talk about anti-Semitism, and I've had quite a few anti-Semitic experiences on the circuit, which a lot of the other Jewish comedians haven't had. And I think that's just partly from being so in your face Jewish, because I can't avoid it. You know, I look different to everyone, and what I talk about is different, but also because I'm a woman, and I think that attracts a certain level of hostility from people. It's a fact on the circuit for others as well, of different faiths and none. But you know, for example, my posters have been defaced for the show It's No Job for a Nice Jewish Girl. When I've performed that at festivals and toured it, in some places people have drawn swastikas on the poster or ripped it down. People have commented on the price on things, whatever the venue has charged. They said, oh, you see, she's Jewish and she's charging money, like as if that's a bad thing to have to pay for a ticket to my show just because I'm Jewish. So there's been a lot of stuff like that. I've had people who've been, you know, on social media, they've been quite hostile, and I just kind of have to suck it up. But there was one incident which actually made its way into my show Hineni, because it was so dramatic, and I tell it slightly differently in the show just for comedic effect. But what happened was, a few years ago, a friend of mine invited me to perform on a Christmas show that he was running through the Edinburgh Festival, because it's the summer. He thought it'd be funny to do a Christmas themed show. And then he would bring me in once or twice a week to do a set about Hanukkah and make a whole joke about the diversity and whatever. And it was a really nice thing. And then I think it was about the second show of the second week during the festival, and he came to introduce me, and he said to the audience, like, you ready for your next act? And I went, yeah. Are you ready for some real diversity? And they went, yeah. He said, welcome to the stage, Jewish comedian Rachel Creeger. And the front row booed. This group of people who's come in together, they were sat in the front row, and they just went boo, like they genuinely booed me for being, I hadn't even told a joke yet for them to not like. It was just that I was a Jewish comedian coming on, and I absolutely froze, because I'm quite high energy act. I come on, I'm bouncy, I'm smiley, and you know, I go with a kind of positive attitude that I think, I'll like you, you'll like me, we'll probably have a good time together. And to have people just immediately reject me on the basis of my religion was quite shocking, especially so blatantly to my face. And also I could see that the whole room was in shock. The rest of the audience were frozen. The other acts were frozen. The compere went like grey. Everyone's mouth was wide open. And I thought, well, whatever I do now, everyone's going to remember this, you know, as well. It's not even just like everyone will think, oh, that woman was funny. Whatever I do next is going to be a thing. So I panicked for a second, and then I did like a dramatic bow, like a Shakespearean bow. And I said, well, thank you very much for the warm welcome. That's not a brilliant joke or anything, but it broke the ice, and the rest of the room laughed, and people, I think it relaxed everybody. And then those people just looked a bit foolish and sat with their arms folded like this at the front. And I just aimed everything I said at everyone else. But if this was a film, Michael, then I would go on to do the best set I've ever done, and they'd carry me out on their shoulders, and you know, it would be a legend for generations. The truth is, I did, I'm sure, an adequate but bit shaky version of the set, because it really threw me off, and I'm sure I did fine. They were very generous and laughing and whatever, and but it was a horrible experience. And then a couple of days later, and this is during the same year in Edinburgh, we had another very bizarre thing happen. There was a group of photographers from a local college who offered to take photos for free of the performers for a project that they were putting on. This project, I think some kind of exhibition, and they said they'd take our photos for free and then we can have the photos in exchange. Excuse me, it's not corona, it's allergies. And so we each were allocated 3 different photographers who each had worked out a lovely location outside where they were going to do the pictures. And when the third one came to get me, we were wandering around, and as we were walking, he said to me, I have to admit I'm a little bit disappointed, which is never the first thing you want to hear from a man you don't know. But he said, yeah, no, I have to admit I'm a bit disappointed. And I said, why? He said, well, when they told me I was taking photos of a Jewish comedian, I genuinely thought you were going to have a much more pronounced nose. And I planned my whole thing around how to kind of make that a feature. And I was again like astonished. It was 2016 or 17 or 18, whenever it was, 2017, I think. And it just seemed such a weird, I don't know how big he thought this nose was going to be, that he could plan his whole picture around it, like the way the light and shade. I said to him, what, you know, that's quite anti-Semitic. And he said, no, I was just thinking the way the light and shade might play across your face. And I said, no, this is a Jewish nose. Jews look like, we're just people. But I thought afterwards about 100 witty comebacks. But it was just astonishing to me that people felt, and I think it might be a Brexit thing here, where people suddenly felt very comfortable to be quite racist right in front of my face. I mean, I could barely see him because of the nose, but I mean, I imagine he was right in front of my face.
It's amazing, that kind of stereotype, and to be so open about it. It's vile. But at the same time, if you can make comedy out of it, you just told it in a refreshing and charismatic way, as you want, then so much power to you. You did some stuff on Christmas, in fact. You did some shtick about Christmas.
Yeah, because I love Christmas. I mean, not that we're ever allowed to celebrate it, but my mum would make an ironic turkey around the 25th, but it wasn't for Christmas, it was just for fun. And we do, I mean, Christmas was a big thing for me. I love, because it seemed like a thing for other people, and the grass is always greener. And it didn't mean I didn't love Hanukkah as well, because obviously I do love Hanukkah, especially donuts. But yeah, I have got material about loving Christmas, because Christmas gigs are a big deal here, and you have to have stuff to say, and Hanukkah gigs are a big deal, and you have to have stuff to say. And that way, by talking about Christmas and Hanukkah, I can get twice as many gigs. And if that isn't Jewish, I don't know what is.
Well, this is supposed to be, in fact, you talked about stereotypes too. You were talking about stereotypes about Jewish women at one point, linking to money, and that's again an awful stereotype that we're all too familiar with. But also, I was a little bit surprised when you added promiscuity, because I thought to myself, this idea about a nice Jewish girl not being a stand-up comic, I'm sure Joan Rivers and Amy Schumer and Chelsea Handler and particularly Sarah Silverman might disagree with that notion, but the idea is somehow that if you're telling jokes and if you're creating humor that is making people feel the joy of laughter and so forth, it somehow goes against the grain of what ought to be the serious and is not being kind of study that we associate with Talmud and with Torah and all the rest of it. But there's something really midrashic, I have argued, and it's a thesis of mine, about humor. Humor teaches us a great deal. Humor can teach us lessons we didn't even know the humor could provide for us. I'm talking about jokes as well as just comedic stand-up material, period. But what you've been able to do is you've been able to weave in your Jewishness as well as your awareness of a lot of just ordinary, mundane, quotidian type of things that go on in the everyday. I mean, that's really more of the grist for your mill. Let me get back to the idea about Jewish women. Jewish women have been stereotyped so much in Jewish humor that it's bothered a lot of Jewish women. So where are you on that? Are they really promiscuous?
I mean, who would have the time? You're too busy cleaning and looking after your kids. But I think
Excuse me, most of Jewish humor about Jewish women is about how non-promiscuous and non-sexual they are.
Right. I mean, I think the bit that you're talking about, actually, I was talking about the fact I have dual heritage in that I come from an area called Essex, which has got a reputation for the girls being quite loose. And the fact that, you know, I don't look Jewish, but also I'm not a good representation of a stereotype of an Essex girl. Like, so both those things, I sort of don't meet any of the expectations that people have of either parts of my heritage. So I don't think I ever particularly said that I think Jewish girls are promiscuous, but I talk quite a lot. In fact, I did a gig today at lunchtime, which probably seems quite weird to you because it might be lunchtime now where you are. I'm not very good with time zones, but there's a few gigs that run here for parents and their babies where you're only allowed to bring babies who are under 1, so they're not going to pick up any rude words, although I don't use any rude words on stage, and the parents can have a nice drink and socialize with other parents and hear a club set that they would hear at 10:30 at night somewhere else if they didn't have a young baby. And my club set talks about sex education in faith schools and how I went through many, many years of the Jewish education system here, which is set up to train us only to be wives and mothers, but without giving us any of the tools to facilitate that because they avoid that subject so intensely. So I talk all about the different ways that the school tried to teach it without teaching it. And I found that anyone who went to a faith school, whether that's a convent Catholic school or Christian Brothers or a madrasa, whatever it might be, I sort of always ask the audience if anyone went to one of those type of schools and tell them, you know, this is going to be probably quite a difficult thing for them to hear, and a helpline number is going to come up and we can all have a drink afterwards to commiserate of our shared experience, because mine might be through a Jewish lens, but the teaching, if you were taught by nuns, was very, very similar. But I was interested in something you said earlier regarding the stereotyping, because I have dropped one joke in all these years from my material that I don't perform now outside of Jewish audiences at all, because it played on a stereotype about Jews and money. And it was a really good joke. Like, it was, you know, we call them the golds, the ones that always get a laugh. And I was quite happy with this joke until one day I was performing it somewhere in the north of England in a kind of an area where there's never, a Jew has never probably set foot on the streets of that town. And I did this joke, and then I saw someone in the audience. Well, I'll tell you what the joke was. I'll tell you what it was about. It was talking about how about 20 years ago I was in hospital for a very long time. And when I moved to a particular hospital, they had kosher meals, because the hospitals here do have to provide food for your ethnic needs, but they'd bulk bought one particular kosher hospital meal, because most people, you go in, maybe you're in for a day, maybe 2 days. It's not that common to be in for a long time. So they kept bringing me the same meal 3 times a day. And if you were British, I would tell you which meal it was, because if you've ever been in hospital, you would recognize it. Anyway, so in the bit of material, I talk about how, you know, I was getting this the same meal day after day, and I was visited by my aunt and uncle, and they were horrified by this. And my uncle said, you know, I think this is disgusting. Like, the fact that the head of catering has only bought one kind of meal, and that's what you're having 3 times a day. It's horrendous. She's got no thought for your quality of life, and it makes me suspect that the head of catering is anti-Semitic. And my aunt said, don't be ridiculous. The fact that she bulk bought them because it would be a discount suggests to me that the head of catering is probably Jewish. And Jewish audiences had always loved it. And then I don't remember how it came about, but I told this joke, a slightly fancier version of that joke in this northern town. And there was a few people who laughed, but I distinctly heard a guy say to the person next to him, yeah, that's true. That is what they do. That is true. And I was like,
that raises a real dilemma, Rachel, because it's always been a dilemma for me. You know, you say you can tell those kind of jokes to Jews and they laugh. And there's a lot of humor that does stereotype Jews that Jews appreciate and Jews like. And the important thing for comedians often is, did it get a laugh? Will it get a laugh? That's really litmus test, the Uber litmus test. But some of these jokes I discovered are not only anti-Semitic by sort of serious definition, but also misogynist.
Right.
And now we're in a woke period. I had to exclude a joke from my book, for example, which actually is kind of a Jewish joke, but it's also a joke that would be in many ways unacceptable today to Black people.
Right.
There's a joke about a young woman who joins the Peace Corps, and I'll tell the joke, goes and joins the Peace Corps and comes back with a Watusi husband who is, about 8 feet tall and has a bone in his nose. And the mother says, "I said, rich doctor." So the joke kind of holds up in many ways, and yet it's not a joke that's appropriate anymore. It's not a joke that should be told. And where do you start drawing the lines becomes an important thing. You deal so much with everyday kinds of things and being a mother and just kind of Seinfeld humor in some respects, so you don't have to toe that line or be that careful about it. But I've talked to a lot of joke tellers and humorists, including a very famous one named John Cleese, and they say they can't even go to the college campuses in the United States anymore. Chris Rock has said this, Seinfeld has said this, because it's too politically correct. They can't tell jokes the way they used to be able to tell jokes. There's something kind of sad about that.
I mean, I have very mixed feelings around that, because I think that we're possibly, well, I don't really like the expression woke, but I think that perhaps there's more sensitivity now to the idea that sometimes your joke can hurt somebody. And I think that's where I feel a sense of responsibility in my comedy. I can't speak for other people, but I think with that joke, for example, that I mentioned before, which I did kind of such a sketchy version for you now, but I realized that that is reinforcing a negative stereotype. And I don't want to be the person who then causes people to have that opinion. And also, like, I wouldn't want to tell a joke where someone in the room felt like I'd personally hurt them. And I think there are subjects which are going to be difficult for people. So, for example, I have quite a lot of material about my own death. I've got quite a bit of material about the influence of the Holocaust on me growing up, and my thoughts about Nazis and whatever. And, that can make people uncomfortable, but that's all talking about myself and my life, if you see what I mean. That's not saying anything about you. And I think jokes where you might actively be hurting people through your racism or misogyny or homophobia, I don't find them that funny. And I wouldn't tell them, because I don't think they're clever and I don't think they're funny. And I think you need to, if you're going to go down the path, and some of the people you mentioned are clever and their jokes are clever. So Sarah Silverman is a great example, I think, because a lot of her humor is shining a light on other people's attitudes. So when people say, oh my goodness, like she's being a this, she's being a that, when she did her material around rape, that's a great example, because it was actually shining a light on the way we, society, behave really quite despicably to the victims. But people sometimes hear a word and then they jump to the conclusion about the material.
Sarah Silverman about being raped, but it was a Jewish doctor. So, it's again the Jewish doctor jokes that's put them in a different category. I respect your sensitivity to this, and I think it's wonderful that you feel the way you do. Sometimes the lines, though, are very difficult and they get kind of fuzzy. What would you think, for example, about Larry David using, and it goes back to Mel Brooks when he talks about Springtime for Hitler, and Mel Brooks talks about a survivor meeting with someone from the TV show Survivor. I mean, that's
my favorite episode of that series, I have to say.
But there are people who are sensitive to even bringing up the Shoah or the Holocaust in that way.
Right.
You mentioned the Holocaust. Right?
I think, if you've got ownership of that story, and it's part of your personal heritage, it's part of your family history, then you have the right to talk about it. If Chris Rock wants to talk about his ethnic background and his growing up and the history of his community, you can't, that's hard for somebody else to judge. That's his story to tell. And I love that episode, the Survivor episode of Larry David, Curb Your Enthusiasm. I have to say, my husband can't watch it. He finds it not just that it's particularly offensive, the cringeness of it he doesn't like. So I think there's lots of reasons why people love or don't love Larry David, and they are literally the flip side of the same coin. So I think if you can kind of justify the ownership of that material based on your life and your real experience, then you can talk about what you want. And I also kind of like when comedians are very upfront about who they are and the sort of thing they're going to do, because then you have a choice to go and see them or not. And I always make sure that, for example, if I'm advertising a solo show, I've written quite a few now, that it's quite clear the sort of thing it's going to be about. And then someone, if it's not, it doesn't have to be everyone's thing. We don't all like the same stuff. You don't have to come. But I think, you know, I personally try to not do things that I think are going to actively hurt somebody if I can avoid it. And I might not get that right all the time.
There is a whole type of humor, though, excuse me, that is aggressive. And I think Don Rickles is a classic example, or Jackie Leonard. But also a type of humor that's radioactive, that, you know, goes to areas that are, and sometimes they can be very funny when they go cross that line or that boundary. You pretty much put the lines up, though. I mean, you don't want to hurt anybody, and you don't want to say anything that's going to really offend in a deep way or profound way.
But I think I do cross lines, you know, weirdly, because people on the mainstream circuit haven't seen an Orthodox Jewish woman get up and talk about how about her obsession with the Nazis coming back when she was young in jokes. Do you know what I mean? So I think that is crossing line. I think when I'm talking to them about TV, I talk a lot about TV shows, and I love watching television and I love popular culture, and I talk about how I take in. I'll give you an example because it's an American show, so it might be more kind of accessible for people. There's a show called Doomsday Preppers. I don't know if you've ever seen, and if you haven't, I highly recommend it. But I talk about this show, Doomsday Preppers, which is Americans who are, you know, preparing for the end of civilization as we know it, and then people come and inspect them and judge them and all these different things. I've got this whole piece of material about how I realized that I was obsessed with this show because that's how Jewish people function. Like, we're always waiting for the end of the world as we know it. We always make sure our cupboard's full. We always, you know, this is stuff that people haven't heard, because the rest of the Jewish comics here, and there are some absolutely brilliant Jewish comedians on the circuit, not very many because it's not like America, and the things that they talk about are a little bit more to do with just when people hear I'm Jewish, they think this and that, whatever, then because it isn't so integrated into everything in their lives and everything they think, because their lives are generally speaking quite secular. So it's crossing a line for people because it's a story that they are not familiar with, or it's an attitude and an outlook. And also because I'm subverting their expectations, that they think that all Orthodox women are Hasidic women, you know, and very oppressed and have to dress in a certain way, behave in a certain way. And there are elements of that, but that isn't my life. I'm clearly not very oppressed, and let anyone try and oppress me, they'll see what happens.
Well, we're going to go to questions, but you just prompted me. You gave me a nice prompt to tell a joke about Hasidism, which is very different than Orthodoxy, as I'm sure you are well aware, but a lot of people kind of conflate them. But one of my favorite jokes is a joke about a man who escapes from Nazi Germany, goes to England, makes a very good living there, and in fact is quite successful, but his father is in the Warsaw Ghetto, and he stages this daring operation where he takes his father out of the Warsaw Ghetto, brings him into England, and says to his father, "You are now in England. I'm an English citizen. I want you to think of yourself as an Englishman, because I think of myself, Papa, as an Englishman." And the first thing he does with his father is takes him to Bond Street and gets him a tailored, beautiful suit. He gives up all his gabardine and all his habiliments as a chassid. Then he takes him to a tonsorial place, and they start cutting his hair. He says, "I want you to have a whole new look. You're an Englishman now." And they're cutting his hair, and the old man starts weeping, sobbing, and his son says to him, Pa, why are you crying? Why are you sobbing? Because you feel you're losing your Jewish identity?" He said, "No, I'm crying because we lost India." Okay. Anyway, I love that joke. Getting some questions for you.
Okay.
First, a comment from an anonymous attendee who says, "She is like British Midge Maisel." That's a compliment.
So that's interesting, because if people bring up the marvelous Mrs. Maisel, I normally say they have to pay £1 or $1 to tzedakah, you know, because when that show came out, you can imagine how many times people mentioned it. Have you seen it? Have you watched it? Do you know of it? And I wrote a show about the way that people were constantly comparing me to Mrs. Maisel, and it was called Mrs. Maisel and Me, and I previewed it, and I realized that in the UK it had only really been watched mainly by half a dozen Jews, and no one knew what it was. So they'd come and see it, and then they'd be like completely bewildered by all my comparisons. But I'm going to take that as a compliment, because it is a great show.
And did they talk to you also about, I'm just curious about Stiesel and about Unorthodox? Those have become hits, global major hits.
Yeah, amazing. And we did for Jew Talking to Me, we always do a little video for our series launch, and our third series came out the same time as the third series of Stiesel. So we did a spoof of Stiesel for that, which was actually really fun.
A viewer named Edward says, a rabbi told me cholent is Jewish chili. I don't know what we're to make of that, but that's just a comment, I think. Robin says, Anthony Baker, male Orthodox British comedian? Who wants to know?
Ashley Blaker, I think is who you mean. So yeah, he's the only other Orthodox Jewish comedian in the UK, but he doesn't perform on the mainstream circuit. He does his own solo shows and just his own theatre shows. So he's not doing the pubs and clubs, you know, like I do, with mixed bills of different acts. But he's also brilliant. And actually, Ashley was the producer of the show 2525, which was mentioned by Suzanne earlier.
And here's Paula, who says, I'm loving this performance. You are so cute and genuine. I hope you come across the pond.
Oh, thank you. I look forward to you buying your ticket if I ever do.
This is an anonymous attendee who wants to know, how much is genuine?
That's my mother for sure. Sorry.
How much is genuine ignorance, jokes that's supposed to be funny to cause a reaction from people, especially by non-Jews, and comment or non-comments from the Jewish person, or serious on purpose, hateful speech, or for whatever reason why they say it? I'm not certain what the question is there, but I think the gist of it is, again, getting back to how do we react to jokes that certainly touch on perhaps a sense of enmity or stereotyping or negativity.
Well, one example maybe is jokes about Israel, because obviously Israel-Palestine is a big topic across everywhere. And you know, there are a lot of comedians who do political or satirical or topical material. And I really think about it when someone tells a joke about Israel, about what my reaction is and why. So for example, if what they tell is uncomfortable, but based on truth, then I have to like sit with my discomfort, because that's on me. And if I'm at a gig and another comedian tells a joke about Israel that actually isn't factually accurate and is based on propaganda or lies or whatever, then I have been known to sometimes speak to them afterwards and say, you know, at the end of the day, you can criticize people's governments. You know, political satire is very important. It's an important tool for Jewish, you know, comedy from, you know, thousands of years ago, when we were the Badchanim and the shtetls, and we'd make jokes about the noblemen because it was the only way of dealing with the horribleness that was going on in our lives. So, you know, I think political satire is a very, very important freedom, but it needs to be grounded in truth or opinion based on truth. If it's spreading lies on whatever subject, then that's an incitement to racial hatred, and that's a very different thing. So
okay. I have to ask you whether you find this joke funny or whether you find it stereotypical. I'll put you on the spot. There are four people. One is Israeli, one is Russian, one is American, and one is Polish. And a man comes up to him and says, "Excuse me, gentlemen, I'm taking a survey. I want your opinion of the meat shortage." And the Polish guy says, "What's meat?" And the American says, "What's a shortage?" And the Russian says, "What's an opinion?" And the Israeli says, "What's excuse me?" Now, is that?
Yeah, it's a very old joke.
It's an old joke, but it's a stereotype of Israeli.
It is a stereotype.
Yes, yeah.
And that joke has existed actually for much longer than that format. Like versions of that joke date back a long way. I mean, and I think that, you know, that's gentle stereotyping. I don't find that offensive because I'm not Israeli or Polish or American or Russian. I guess I'm a quarter Russian and Polish, maybe. I think, you know, I think there's nothing, I don't think that's a mean joke, and I think that's obviously just trying to be funny, but there are people who get offended by, I tell you what,
Maybe the touchstone is meanness, huh? Are the jokes meant to be mean or not?
I don't know. I guess it's, I don't know. I think I'd have to give that more thought. But actually the most racist jokes that I've ever been told to me were told by a group of Holocaust survivors. And that put me in a very difficult position. I went to perform at the Holocaust Survivors Centre here in London. And there were these sort of three men who were a bit annoyed that I wasn't a man because they really only like jokes told by men. That's what they told me at the beginning. So I knew that from the outset. But at the end of the show, I was invited, it was on Hanukkah, they invited me to stay. There's donuts, I was all happy. And these three guys came up to me and they said, you know, can we tell you some jokes, you know, some good jokes, which is an amazing thing because actually men do that to female comedians after virtually every gig just to make sure that we know better jokes. And I said, okay, no problem. And then these guys honestly told me if this was a cartoon, then my hair would have been blowing back and my eyes like wide like that, because they were properly racist with accents and facial grimacing and gestures and whatever. And I didn't laugh because I don't find that humor funny, but I also felt like I didn't really know what to do. These are three old people who've been through, you know, the worst, most outrageous experiences that human beings have perpetrated on each other. And I didn't really feel like I could say, now hang on, just, I didn't want to stop them from talking really. But I also didn't find it funny. And then one of them said to me, I don't think that you enjoyed our jokes very much, did you? And I said, well, no, but I thought you told them really expressively. I just thought, well,
Right, you should be a diplomat.
yeah,
Let me read a few more comments that are coming in and some questions. Anonymous attendee says, so I am living in the wrong city. I need to be in Essex. Is there a city where the women are loose and Jewish? If so, I want to know where. And
it's not the Jews specifically in Essex. It's if you really want to get a sense of what that place is like, not particularly for the Jews, there's a TV show called Towie, The Only Way is Essex, and I bet that's on Netflix or something. You can watch it. It's a horrendous show about the kind of people that live in the area. It's a funny place because it was at one point, I mean, the wider Essex, not just the bit where I'm from is the bit that I was talking about before, but the Essex itself, it was one of the biggest Jewish communities in Europe when I was growing up. So all the areas had massive communities and loads of young people, and it was all very exciting. And now everyone's moved away from there really.
I've always identified it, of course, with the Earl of Essex, but let me read a comment from another viewer who writes, being Orthodox, how much from other Orthodox Jews does she get? Well, first I want to read a comment from Aileen Bloom, which you will appreciate. She says, she's terrific, meaning you. And this is an anonymous attendee who says, being Orthodox, how much from other Orthodox Jews does she get flack for being a female comedic, it says, let me say she means comic. What feedback does she get from other non-Orthodox Jews, especially female ones? And what about feedback from male Jewish Orthodox comedics? What feedback does she get from non-Jewish female comics and male comics?
Okay, so I'll deal with the Jewish community first. And I'd say that I get 50% immense support and 50% criticism, which is very Jewish, isn't it? It's what you get from your own family. So that doesn't surprise me. I think I'm modern Orthodox, so I'm living a kind of normal life within my Jewish boundaries, but the people who are more ultra Orthodox, right-wing, Hasidic, Haredi, they find that even the idea of me very difficult. I mean, they wouldn't really come to my shows, but there was one quite dramatic situation when I was invited to perform for an event that was being put on to support a charity that was a very ultra-Orthodox charity, but the person who was supporting it was modern Orthodox. So they'd had some reason to benefit from this charity, and they thought, well, they'll do a fundraiser, and they invited me to headline this fundraiser. And there was a really shocking response from within the Haredi community, where people were told that if they came to see the show, that it was going to affect their businesses, or their children getting into school. If there's the sort of person who come and see a woman on stage drawing attention to herself, like me, then you know, their children would struggle to have a shidduch, like to get married later, and all these kind of threats put on people for coming. And it was a really quite horrible situation, which I dealt with comedically, because what else can you do? I actually first offered to pull out of the show, because I thought it was more important they raised the money. And then the organizer was like, no, we won't be bullied by these people. But that was I think that's the only time where it's been so confrontational, where people have actually sort of kind of threatened people if they were to come and see me perform. But mostly people are quite supportive. I've had like a few really weird incidents. I had a visit once to a mikveh out of town, because when you talked about the things of touring and how my orthodoxy impacts on my life and whatever, then when you need to go to the mikveh, you know, the ritual bath, for anyone who wants to Google it, you have to go on a specific date. And I was touring out of town, and that date came up, and I had to text the local one wherever I was, and I just texted the number and said, you know, can I have an appointment on Thursday or whatever day? And the person said, yes, give me your name. And I said, Rachel, and that was that. And when I got to the mikveh at night on that occasion, this woman came out to meet me, and then she looked at me, and then she was like, are you Rachel Creeger? And I was like, yes. And she goes, oh God, I'm such a massive fan. And that was just mortifying, because then she walked me in, and then she said, I'm going to show you to our very best bathroom. So then it was like, you know, I don't really deal well with the recognition, and then I'm sort of quite a low-key person. So I was like, no, anything's fine, anything's fine. And then the idea that I was then going to have to be like naked and doing my ritual immersion in the mikveh with this woman who's like into me as a celebrity was quite bizarre. And I have to say, when she came to get me to bring me to the mikveh pool, she said to me, oh, I've just been Googling you to see what you're up to and find out where you're performing tonight, as if she was then going to follow me to whatever comedy club and sit in the back and think about what she's just seen. It was very, very surreal. The non-Jewish community find everything I say fascinating, because they've not heard it before. So generally speaking, apart from the racists and anti-Semites, people are quite friendly and supportive.
Let us conclude with that nice story. I told you, I think I had a brother-in-law claim he was a lifeguard in the mikveh, which I don't think could ever have been substantiated. Thank you, Rachel. It's been a delight talking to you, and I'm going to turn things back to Suzanne.
Thank you.
Thank you both. That was a wonderful conversation, very fun, very informative, and we really do hope you are able in the next year or so come to the United States. I know you have a lot of new fans who would like to purchase tickets and see you perform. I wanted to let everybody know that we will send a follow-up email in the next day or two, and we'll include a link to Rachel's website and her podcast, Talkin To Me, and we'll also include a link to Michael's book. And please be sure to go to momentmag.com, where you can register for next week's program. We have cookbook author Paula Scheuer, who will be showing us how to do some recipes for the upcoming Jewish holidays. Again, Michael, Rachel, thank you so much. Thank you to the audience, and we will see you next time. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.